Thank you, Kamala, and good morning to all the participants. Our first panel, Geopolitical Shocks and Boardroom Readiness. And of course, we have Professor Bob Garratt, our Global Ambassador, Kantha Naicker, I hope I pronounced that right, CEO of Africa Future Foresight Institute based in South Africa, and Pradeep Chaturvedi, Vice President, the Institute of Directors of India, and former Chairman, Institute of Engineers, Delhi, India. So Bob Garratt is an international consultant and academic. He specializes in the review and development of boards of directors and works in 5 continents. He is best known for his long-selling book, The Fish Rots from the Head, Developing Effective Directors, and his follow-up book, Stop the Rot, Reframing Governance for Directors and Politicians, is proving much read during the COVID, or was much read during the COVID pandemic. His latest book, Shining a Light on a Naughty World, is a working title, is due for publication next year. Pradeep Chaturvedi, as I said, is the Vice President, Institute of Directors of India. He's a mechanical engineer and has been involved with environment and energy policy and planning and implementation of energy projects under the UN agencies for over 3 decades in India and other Asia-Pacific countries. For his lifetime contribution, he has been conferred Engineer of the Year 2013 Award of the Federation of Engineering Institutions of Asia and the Pacific. He was a member of the Perspective Planning Group of Planning Commission and member of the Energy Policy Expert Group. He is Vice President, World Environment Foundation and Institute of Directors of India. And Kantha is the founder, GovernEx, and the CEO of Africa Future Foresight Institute. She's an accomplished governance and accounting professional with over 25 years of experience across the private, public, and non-profit sectors. A former chairperson of the board of the South African Institute of Professional Accountants, Kantha has led at the highest levels of governance, navigating complex organizational change, stakeholder engagement, and strategic foresight initiatives. She serves on the board of the Fetola Foundation, supporting enterprise and supplier development across Africa, and has recently joined the Transform Global as an advisory board member for a South African chapter. So, we have a well-qualified panel. I see Bob has stepped away a little bit. But the topic is a very, very important one, given all that is happening in the world and the rise of geopolitical risk, very significant geopolitical risk. So I will let Bob open the button. Bob, you're on mute, I think. No, go ahead. You're not on mute. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah. Thank you, and greetings from a lovely, sunny but rather chilly London, late afternoon. So as you watch over the next hour, you'll see the light behind me disappear, as it's one of those awful times in London when it gets dark at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But it's good to see everybody, and my sympathies again to our colleagues in Jamaica. I mean, that is awful, and I don't know what I can do, but I will offer any help I can to them. The title of this session, Geopolitical Shocks and Boardroom Readiness, in one way, I've only got a one-word answer to the question, are boards ready? And the answer is no, full stop. None of us are. But then if you think about it, boards can never be ready, because the whole point about being a board is to look into a very uncertain future. And whatever you call that uncertain future, and there are various very fashionable words around at the moment, the one I tend to use is polycrisis, that we're having all sorts of things happening simultaneously, most of which we do not understand, but all of which we have to try and make some sort of sense of to ensure that we have a future for our particular organization. So this whole notion of readiness is, I think, fundamental and something that the CCGI must really, and already is, but must really concentrate on in the future. The activity, though, is a strange one for most directors. I mean, Nigel, I will now update you on the title for my book because I only signed the contract on Friday last week, and they have decided in the end. The book's title is Building Intelligent Boards, full stop. And this whole idea of intelligence, what it is and how we develop it, and includes artificial intelligence, but for the most part, the book is on very much human intelligence and the way in which artificial intelligence may or may not be able to back that up to some significant degree. But the idea of the intelligence is very much around how do we scan the horizon, our horizons, to try and make sense of the future. And this horizon scanning activity is one that many, many directors feel extraordinarily uncomfortable with. As they say, well, we're not, we're not magicians. We cannot decide how the future is going to happen. That is absolutely true. But you do have intelligence enough to be able to think about, well, what does this mean? And what are the trends? And how do we begin to see the shapes of what the future is? And it is continuous, this change. As I say, it's also simultaneous. So it's quite difficult to get your head around. And yet, as a director, you have to. And the only way I think I can help there, and with the boards I work with, is to focus on the act of learning. How do we take out time, particularly time, to get away from the operational activities, to really have a serious conversation and a continuous conversation for us all to learn and for our organizations to be part of that learning, not just the board as a separate little entity, but how do we create that and how do we generate the new perspectives that we will need for future directors? Because I do think we're reaching a point now where even politicians are beginning to realize that directing is quite separate from managing or accounting or being a lawyer or whatever. It is actually coming together, and you are doing good work in this area, the CCGI. It's coming together to actually form the basis of a true profession. It is different, it's distinctly different. And you've got to do the two things. You've got to look out into the future. So what are those geopolitical and other shocks that are occurring on the one hand? And yet, professionally, you have to keep your organization together. You've got to push ahead and yet also make sure it's under prudent control. And to me, that is the basis of a very serious profession, one at the moment, which is terribly, terribly undervalued in most countries, in most organizations, in most governments. It's something that we are just striving towards, and good for CCGI to continue to push for that. Remembering that in doing that, though, and becoming a professional, one actually has to do something that many people find almost impossible and certainly conceptually very difficult, which is to actually develop, if you like, that helicopter view of getting above the immediate operational activities in the organization and actually being able to develop yourself so that you actually have independence of thought, and independence of thought whilst you are scanning those changing horizons. And that takes quite a lot of time and definitely some effort. But I would also argue, and I'll come back to this, that it has to be done cooperatively. You cannot do it on your own. You cannot be a single director sitting around a boardroom table with glorious pictures of the future and some idea of how the whole thing holds itself together. and then try on your own to convince everybody else that this is right, and you are right. That's a good way of getting isolated and thrown out of a board. So how do we build that independence of thought? What are the necessary care, skill, and diligence elements that we need to bring together, both individually and collectively as a board? And how, in the end, do we make sure that this is done diligently? There is due diligence to this developmental process, which is hardly ever talked about at all. And one of the interesting things I find at the moment, there's so much confusion in the world, particularly around boards, that they really do have to begin to learn how to work as a team. And that notion of the board as a team is often talked about, but it's rarely is anything done about it, very much indeed. But I go back to, I don't know, 30 years ago when I was doing work with colleagues at Ashridge Management School in the UK, and they came up with a notion that I've used with boards ever since. And that was that there are two types of teams. And one of the team is a team together, as they called it. And these are the typical teams, sports teams, those sorts of things, executive teams, people who are working together all the time with specific ends in mind and working very hard to cement themselves together. The board is a very different concept, and this often isn't talked about. They argued, and I've used this ever since, that a board is a team apart, not a team together. And so how a board actually comes together to work as a team is quite a skilled activity, because they have to be able to bond rapidly when they are together, whether that's online or face-to-face is irrelevant. They have to be able to bond rapidly. And yet, most of the time, they won't be talking with each other. They won't see each other. And so that begins to develop a whole new way of thinking about the board as this team apart. And it's just as an example, I use something which my academic colleagues tell me is 50 years out of date, and Bob, you should never ever publish in this area. It's just, and it's using the old-fashioned steam-driven Mark I pest analysis. In my case, I use two Ps. So one is the political environment, one is the physical environment. I use 1E, which is the economic environment. I use 1S, which is the social environment. 1T, which is absolutely critical nowadays, which is the technology and science environment. And the last one, which has suddenly caused all sorts of geopolitical, is the trade environment. But I use that double P, ES, double T, pest analysis as a way of bonding a team. And what I do is, if say you've got 6 people around a boardroom table, or 12 people, or whatever it is, there happen to be 6 elements to the pest analysis, and I will ask 2 of them over the next 3 months to report back to the board on what they think is occurring in the political environment, however defined. Another 2 to look at the physical environment, another 2 economics, another 2 at social changes, another 2 at technology, and another 2 at trade. And if you like, this is the board's homework. And quite a lot of directors in my experience don't like being given homework. They say, no, we're busy enough when we're doing real work away from the board, and to have this imposed on us is an absolute travesty. But I insist, no, that is what the board's role is. And frankly, if you don't like it, then you're not going to be a very effective director in future, because the future is all about this sort of homework and the intellectual capacity and the courage to actually face up to this multi changing geopolitical world that we're now having to face. And many of them tell me, but you know, we've been senior managers, we've had a great career, which is often true, and we were always told never get involved in politics. Well, I'm not asking them to get involved in party politics, but I'm asking them to understand the political trends and the economic and the social and the technology trends that are occurring around them, and to create their own map or their own pictures of how their future is going to be in relation to the future health of their organization. And so this whole thing about becoming a team apart, in the first instances gets quite a lot of pushback, but we've had some very successful experiences of doing this. And that changes the shape and the agenda and the timing of board meetings, because really it's a continuous learning process. And there are points of time where the board will come together electronically and times when they must get together socially to actually not just talk through this stuff, but some of the other things I'll mention in a minute. And you'll know me only too well to know that therefore behind all this is the notion of learning, and that notion that our rate of learning as a board must be equal to or greater than the rate of change in that very complex geopolitical environment out there. And that's a key part. Two other areas then I'll go into very briefly. One is the shocking other side of this, which is what I'm beginning to see particularly now almost daily in the US, which is the abandonment of much of the underpinning of corporate governance, as was in the US. But this is also the quite conscious political wish to undermine common law in this area, which for Commonwealth countries is a major, major concern. And we're seeing, particularly the Trump administration, really hacking into doing, if you see what's happening in Delaware, which was in its own right, a sort of model of how the Americans did it. They didn't do it well. And I've always, as you know, said the US in this area was pretty much a basket case. Well, I now think it is absolutely a basket case. It is alarming what is happening. And to the extent that not only are they trying to destroy the laws that existed and not replace them with anything else, but they're also destroying the academic world around them. And I was horrified to find 2 weeks ago that one of my colleagues, a professor at Harvard Business School, now goes into work with virtually no personal identification other than an ID card, and he goes in with a burner phone. He will not even take his personal phone in with him because the pressure, the political pressures outside are now so extreme that he and his colleagues, and remember this is in the business school, are really quite alarmed at the phenomenal attack that's going on around the issues of effective corporate governance in the US. So that does worry me. And particularly because if you think about that, under common law, which the US has normally been persuasive of, you've had to declare, you had to have a declaration of interests as a board member and not to be involved in third-party transactions, etc. And yet, at the moment, we have a president in the US who is spinning out bitcoins and all sorts of other things in such a way that I'm very alarmed at the high rate of corruption that is going on in the US at the moment. And my worry is that some countries might begin to decide that they will follow a similar route. Whereas I think the Commonwealth countries have actually, in a very gentle and quiet way, held out against such activities and been trying to build in the reverse direction. So this is a very, very serious political shock, geopolitical shock, which is occurring and will run through the system. And we see that also, obviously, in terms of trade, which is becoming a major issue at the moment. the attacks on DEI and ESG, which is part of this conference, so we must deal with that in the next 2 days, the frontal assault on DEI and ESG. It is a worry to me, but I'm happy to say there are people fighting back already. And if you're interested in what I've just been saying, that little bit I just said, then if you look on the website, someone like, and again, it's the women who are beginning the fight back, but particularly Nell Minow in the States of ISS fighting back on behalf of institutional shareholders. She is gloriously outspoken and still at least has a sense of humor about it, although she is very passionate. And well, it's not really a sense of humor. She had a sense of the absurd about it and is sort of bitterly funny in what is occurring. So these things are around. If we flip the focus now onto more the geo part of geopolitical, I'm just intrigued. This is where horizon scanning for everybody on the board, but hopefully in their little units. And when I asked them to spend 3 months looking at political and 3 months looking at, then they all do that simultaneously. And then at the end of the 3 months, the ones who've been doing political will do physical, and the ones doing physical will do economic, etc. So you have a rotating 18-month period over which they are continuously searching the horizon. And looking at that, obviously we must keep very close watch on the very interesting develops in India. And we have a very distinguished panelist about to talk on that, so I will not try and go into that area too much. And on China, which, as you know, I've known for some 40 years. And recently I've had a visiting professorship, only just starting, in Indonesia, and I'm very interested in the rise of Indonesia. Particularly not only the rise of it as a country, a large country in its own right, but the way its form of Islam is being almost retrofitted into the Arab world. And that is a very interesting development, which I would certainly keep a very close eye on. And then we have, for example, the implosion of Russia. I mean, Russia is an extraordinary country anyway, going across 10 time zones with a very small population and a very small economy. And one of the things that shocks a lot of the boards I deal with, when I ask them, well, what is the actual GDP of Russia, in relation to other countries, where does Russia stand? And I've never had anybody who's been able to give me a simple answer to that. And the answer is it's slightly smaller than Italy. But it's Italy with nuclear weapons and a particular political credo. And but it's running into enormous economic difficulties at the moment. They can't sustain this crazy war they've had. And now, looking at many sources, at least 1 million dead, mainly, interestingly enough, not from, if you like, mainland Russia, but from the Far Eastern Russia or Central Siberia and those areas. And they've been putting those troops into the meat grinder, as they call it. And they've lost so many now. They're actually beginning to have to recruit in their homeland. With the economic situation as is, that's going to create all sorts of social unrest, and that is beginning to happen. So it's going to be interesting. If we're horizon scanning, that is something to watch. But it's also interesting to me because if you think of the other areas that are undergoing change, one of the things we forget, well, we forget 3 key areas in geopolitical horizon scanning. One is really Africa, and Kantha, I'm hoping you'll be able to talk to us about that, please. One is Asia, and I've already mentioned our distinguished contributor about to talk about that. But the other one that intrigues me is Antarctica. Mm. And in fact, I would add both of the poles. I would add Arctic into that. And the Russian, Chinese, Japanese, American push across the very top of the world in the Arctic originally, but also into Antarctica, is something I think the horizon scanning elements of our boards need to think about seriously, because it also impacts on climate change and on all sorts of other movement and immigration, those areas. So those are the sorts of things I'll be looking for. And I'll finish by saying, but you knowing me, we always need to build time to do this horizon scanning. If we can do it as a team apart, that will be even better. And if we can really build our rate of learning to be equal to or greater than the rate of change, it will be a miracle, but it's worth going for that miracle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that excellent introduction to a very interesting topic. I mean, for me, intelligence translates into awareness of what is coming down the track. And while we may never be prepared, we should be at least very much aware of what could be coming down the track. So let's hear from Pradeep and get his perspective coming from Asia. Good evening, Pradeep.
Good evening, all the distinguished panelists. It was wonderful listening to Bob, an opening statement, which really set the ball rolling, and he has presented the perspective of the geopolitical situations and where the boardrooms really face and what are the kind of problems they have. I'd like to deal with more of the practical side of it and not getting into which country is doing what. If you have noticed that after Rio +20, we found that the industry has to play an important role in overall development of the whole globe. Earlier we thought that the governments, the intergovernmental bodies, etc., could be doing the required developmental work, but then they miserably failed. The Millennium Goals could not be met, and 2012 we found that the whole world was still much more miserable place. They thought then they wanted the industry to really come up and play its own role. And we had the globalization had its impact. The World Economic Forum, if we'll just see that various observations that we had, it has really helped in promoting private investments, private technology development, management, which has really led to a multiple effect on the governments growing the economies in various locations. And they also had that it was not that they were dependent on the intergovernmental linkages, but the private industry to industry linkage could carry them much forward. So you also, some of those you who might have attended the COP29 last year, you would have noticed after the election of the US president, everything quieted down in the COP29. They thought that everything is dying out. But there was, at that point of time, there were two COPs that were taking place. One inside the General Assembly, the main hall, where the governments were very subdued and they were thinking that nothing will come out. But then you had the whole private sector, NGOs and all, who were working outside. 4,000 of the companies committing to the UN that they would be supporting the COP movement. There were many those who said that they would meet the Net Zero Alliance. There were others who said that they will bring in the new technologies. So you'll find that industries do depend. Industries do depend on what governments support, and ultimately they do own, but they take their own actions also independent of what governments do. that was really a big eye opener. I just thought that this was I had been traveling for the last 40 years. I had never seen at any point where if the government's view is one side, but the industry that gave us a opportunity that whatever be the geopolitical situation, there will be things that have started off where industries have really put in their money and they have really thought that this is with their advantage. They're not going to go back. They're going to really continue. It's a matter of opportunities as to we have to see how they would like to do how they move ahead. For wars and sanctions to trade alignments, cyber threats and shifting alliances, political shocks can reshape market access, supply chains, workforce dynamics, and investor sentiment overnight. The challenge for business leaders is not merely to respond to anticipate and adapt, to build a boardroom that is geopolitically ready. Now, let me also say that when you find that sanctions are being issued, there are multinational corporations. If their origin is in the country where the sanctions have been announced, then they take one stand. But then all the companies are not based only in one country where the sanctions are being issued. So if you look at the multiple number of companies which are working outside, they do realize that sanctions will have the effect, but then they really find a way to move ahead. They also try to find a way to move around the sanctions. They would not say that if sanctions are issued, then that is the end of the world and as if they are going to close down. And there are several examples where they have found and the companies have been moving forward. And if companies originated from where the sanctions were issued, they may shift from country A to country B, but they'll continue doing their work and they know how to, their boards know really how to get along doing their business. They're not going to lose their working environment which they have earned over the last several areas. Now, some of the recent issues which have really affected are, first of all, the Russia-Ukraine conflict disrupted global energy and commodity markets, triggered inflationary pressures, and forced companies to exit entire regions overnight. The second was the US-China trade tensions redefined supply chain strategies and created a long-term shift towards friend-shoring and near-shoring. Third was Israel-Gaza conflict and tensions in the Red Sea have impacted global shipping routes, particularly for oil and logistics companies. And the fourth was the COVID-19 pandemic, though primarily a health crisis, evolved into a geopolitical and economic shock that exposed vulnerabilities in global interdependencies. Now, in spite of all these four major issues that have emerged, that are the geopolitical impacts, you will find that every one of these countries have been really working with one another. There were the Europeans who were importing the LPG from Russia. They were importing the gas from Russia. They were also buying oil from another country, but they knew that the origin is from Russia. So, so these are things the boards have to really see where do they move and how the continuity can be maintained. Beyond war and conflict, cybersecurity threats, protectionist trade policies, sanctions regimes, and climate-related migration are all geopolitical variables that can upend corporate governance. The implications are multifaceted. It affects the operational systems, that is, supply chain breakdowns, logistics disruptions, and input cost escalation. Supply chain disruptions took some time for people to really see to maintain. But then ultimately now you'll find that supply chains have been maintained. The cost escalations that have been accompanied by the supply chain shifting from one end to another, the people have now become accustomed to doing business on those same lines. The second is the financial, the currency, volatility, sanctions, exposure, and capital flight. This in many countries is thought of and is being faced in the initial phase. But when things settle down, it really people start knowing how to do their business. Now, if you look at the whole process of globalization, I know from 84 to 89 and then up to 94, when UNCTAD spent 10 years to build up the whole system from globalization, and Professor Jagdish Bhakrati played an important role. I mean, now everyone is thinking that we should move out of globalization and narrow down to producing in and near their own countries. So now people realize there are many who are thinking this is coming through. There are others who know how to face this. Now the third risk was reputational risk, ethical risk tied to sourcing, workforce conditions, and political alignments. These in the strategic term, forced market exits, relocation of production, and alignment of long-term business priorities, these are really already working. And I mean, no one had to tell the boards what you need to do. They, by their natural instincts, every board knew where they have to do, where they have to move. They took on board professionals who could advise them. They took on board the independent directors with the competencies to tell them how to face these geopolitics. And then the boards understanding these layers is critical. The geopolitical environment is no longer a backdrop, it is a strategic variable. Now, this is where we take it as a strategic variable, we can work out with it, and this is where the boards are really working. Everyone says that boards of future, but it's not the boards of future, it's the boards of present, which have to deal with the situation and then come out. Because every future direction depends on the decisions that are being taken by the boards of the present. And we have in India, we had been very strict on the corporate governance practices. There are many changes that have come around, but we have also realized that the regulatory bodies have a very important role in maintaining that corporate governance in practice can really be implemented. The our SEBI, which is the main regulator, has now been really asking that when you have the independent directors, they are not supposed to be sitting there as inspectors in the board, trying to false with the board, but they are supposed to bring in the kind of capacities or the gaps that you find the board doesn't have. They must bring that and add value to the board. And if they're not adding, then at the next evaluation, the boards must really think whether they keep those independent directors or they change. But then there's a big shift, and the government, our Ministry of Corporate Affairs, is also taking a very positive stand on it, looking at the board independent directors to be really working for the company as a part of the company and not as an outsider. Now, why boardroom needs geopolitical readiness. There are a few major issues that we have identified in India. This globalization and independence. The globalization of supply chains, that is single event in geographic and cost, cascading effects across continents. For example, a semiconductor shortage in Taiwan can halt automotive production in Europe or India. Boards must understand these dependencies in depth and continuously map how political shifts affect their exposure. But then countries and boards realize and find out what are the shortcomings we have faced, the problem of the semiconductors, of the rare earths, and we have also now find that every country, though nobody wants to have stopped their economy, they are finding out solutions, going out to the countries whom they thought at one time they may not be really be in dialogue, but then now they have struck major agreements, and but then boards must realize. And let me tell you, like in politics or international diplomacy, they say there's no permanent friend and no permanent enemy. In business also, we should not feel that such and such companies from such and such countries may or may not do business with us. You never know. This is ultimately it will be how profitable the business could be. And now people look at not as being sympathetic, but being empathetic to the people. It's not just being good for raising financial resources returns, but what all are you going to do for the society if I can really go on and work with country 2, 3, or 4 and bring for certain sections of my countrymen more happiness. I'll be very happy to do it. And most of the countries are now looking at their policies, which are now merging with the government policy, but at the same time, this is also being promoted. The ESG imperatives are being looked in, but then these are some countries are taking a serious step, but others are really pushing it back. The regulatory complexity. This is this has been this has to be really understood for readiness for geopolitical situations. Sanctions and compliance landscapes are evolving rapidly. Boards must navigate multiple legal frameworks simultaneously. For example, adhering to both Western sanctions regimes and local market laws. A misstep can lead to massive penalties, asset seizures, or reputational damage. Now, we had the Institute of Directors had really prepared our trainers. We do the direct courses for the board of directors, and we have been doing courses in the Middle East. We are doing in Rwanda. We are doing in other places in Africa. Maybe we also, I think we had a discussion with you also with the Caribbean corporate governance, and maybe we can. So we are all our trainers have got into the multiple country complex situations that they face. For example, we have the well-known awards, the Golden Peacock Awards for last 30 years, and our international jury includes Professor Marvin King from South Africa, who is known to be the father of the corporate governance. We have Uwe Sarman, who was the Deputy Secretary General of this UNFCCC. So similarly, we put all these people together. So to see that these complexities, after we studied these things will come in, we thought that even when we have the global awards, even the jury should be really brought in with the very diverse sectors. So they bring in that concept, and then we select the kind of people who will really have that understanding. The last and the most important issue that is being thought of is the cyber and information warfare. Geopolitical tensions increasingly manifest through cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns. Boards must recognize cybersecurity not just as an IT function, but as a geopolitical defense mechanism. Data infrastructure, intellectual property, and digital reputation are all assets in new battlefield. And we got to really find out what all we can do. Now we have to. There is few leadership competencies which have been identified. I'll just name them without getting into the details. The first is the strategic curiosity. Board members should cultivate a continuous learning habit. The second is the ethical reflex. When geopolitical events force difficult choices, such as exiting a profitable market due to human rights concerns, the board's ethical compass must guide decisions. The digital fluency. With cyber and AI tools shaping geopolitics, digital literacy is indispensable, and directors should grasp how data security, algorithm bias, and technology policy intersect with the geopolitical stability. And the last is the crisis communication. Transparency and calm leadership in crisis sustain stakeholder trust. Boards must be equipped to communicate decisively with employees, investors, regulators, and media when geopolitical tensions disrupt. And we have to really be very open to the way the technology will play an important role, and boards have to really look at the technology development. I'll just finish by just giving the Indian context, the opportunity and the volatility. So briefly, India's emergence as a major geopolitical actor, balancing relations between different countries and regional powers, presents both risks and opportunities for the boardroom. And this is now all companies have fully realized and faced it. India benefits from global supply chain realignments as a preferred alternative to China. Yet, Indian companies are also exposed to currency fluctuations, commodity dependencies, and cyber threats. Boards must align with India's strategic autonomy doctrine, ensuring that their international expansions complement national interests and geopolitical positioning. Indian corporations that blend agility, ethical governance, and geopolitical acumen can emerge as trusted global players in a fragmented world. Uh, geopolitical shocks are no longer black swan events. They are the defining reality of this decade. Boardrooms that treat geopolitics as peripheral will find themselves perpetually reacting. Those that embed geopolitical intelligence into their strategy will lead with resilience. A geopolitically ready boardroom is characterized by clarity, adaptability, and ethical courage. It seems beyond borders, integrates technology with foresight, and protects both shareholder value and societal well being. In the end, boardroom readiness is not about predicting every conflict or crisis. It's about building an organization that can withstand them. And that's where the industry comes in. And I'm really grateful to Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute for giving us the opportunity to participate in your first international conference after our MOU that we assigned. My colleague who is coordinating your program, Sana Rahman, is also onto the program. She has registered, and we'll be very happy to collaborate with you in any other way. Thank you very much for your opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. Much appreciated. Some of the things that that came out from your speech, I want to repeat: there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies. And for me, you reinforce what Bob said. It's not about not knowing, but it's about being prepared and being able to respond. And that requires constant scanning of the horizon, constant understanding of the supply chain dynamics, and not being surprised, knowing that we live in a world of constant, if not um, change on steroids. So let's go to Kantha and hear from South Africa. Kantha.
Thank you, Dr. Nigel Romano. Let me keep emphasizing the doctor. Thank you so much to CCGI. Thank you, Kamala. As we were chatting before we started the session, I'm joining you from Durban, South Africa. I do live in Johannesburg. And Kamala and I have a wonderful relationship on LinkedIn, which is where most people meet today, until they come online to kind of meet in person, until they're able to hug each other in person. So it's a real pleasure to be here in your morning, my afternoon, or evening for other people. And I think this is such a vital conversation. And I love Bob as well as Pradeep's comments, because it's a good segue to come into what I want to speak about, which is perhaps a little bit of a softer side of what you as an individual can do from a geopolitical foresight and in an age of turbulence, because we are constantly living in turbulence. I think COVID has really catapulted that whole understanding of what turbulence is. And like Pradeep so said, there's no longer a black swan. You're constantly scanning for the next thing, but having the information and the data to navigate it. So for me, geopolitical forces and shocks obviously they're borderless, as COVID taught us. And their consequences, though, lie within our boardroom squarely. But like Bob spoke about, teams apart and teams together, it's in that team apart that the consequences have that much more consequence, because we don't know each other that well. And it's something that I mentioned to Kamala, and I'll put it up right at the beginning of this conversation. I'm an alumni of an organization called the United World Colleges Movement. We've got 19 colleges across the globe. And one of the things I learned as a 16-year-old when I attended one of these colleges in Canada was that the whole UWC movement rests on the teachings of Kurt Hahn, who was the German philosopher, who said, how can people know each other if they do not live together and understand each other? And it's impossible for us to live together, but we do have in the globe now a really diverse, and as we've discussed in Africa, and I'm South Indian, but I'm a South African Indian, I'm fourth generation. And so we have a very diverse culture in South Africa. So does the Caribbean, so does India in terms of all of the languages, so does anywhere else in the globe because of the great movement and mobilization of people. So if I go back to what Kurt Hahn spoke about, he spoke about knowing each other to understand each other in order to foster peace and harmony. And we'd love to move towards that in today's world based on what we see coming out of some of the major decisions that have been made that have shifted us, and will continue to shift us depending on what decisions are being made almost by the minute. Visa amounts have been put on and then taken off, and I'll make broad reference to them, but it's things that affect us even from an individual perspective. So both through my work at Africa Future Foresight Institute, which is AFI, as well as through GovernEx, I help and try to look at how boards and leaders build what I call anticipatory capacity. So anticipating or learning how to anticipate what comes in the future. And so for me, it's not an ability to just respond to the disruption straight away as if you're in a war room, but it's about lending a compass to what comes towards you and to recognizing the weak signals long before these things arrive. And it's a difficult thing to do because we've been trained almost not to do that. We've been trained to sit in a comfort zone and accept what comes towards us, have our board plan, don't stick anything regarding PES, double P and double T, as Bob said, but just sit there and say, well, today we're doing policies, or today we're doing financials, or today we're doing, and that time in terms of agenda set, or that type of agenda setting has changed. And from a whether we're sitting in the Caribbean, in India, in Asia, in Europe, the question is no longer if the shocks are going to occur, right? For me, it's how prepared are our governance systems to metabolize them into something, into a strategic advantage. So what are we doing as members individually, as on that team apart, that makes sense with being a team together? So we are aware of the volatility, we track the trends, we monitor the risks, we commission the reports, and we see enough of that when we sit in the boardroom. But for me, it's that awareness and then matching that with the inertia and the action to do what needs to be done to take this board or this organization or this country or whatever it is forward. So I want to introduce you to something I use a lot at governance. It's a triad, and it tries to move boards away from awareness into action, because we can receive a report and we can discuss it till the cows come home. But it's about actually doing what needs to take us forward. And that is 3 words: sensing, simulating, and strategizing. Now, boards do a lot of strategizing, right? We have a strategy session once a year. We relook at it. The old days, we used to look 5, 10 years ahead, 3 years, 5 years. COVID arrived, you're almost looking at it every board meeting. But for me, sensing the shifts, scanning the horizon, like has been alluded to already, for very faint signals. So, somebody said to me, so what, and this was a small business board, so what that, the dollar changes? I said, well, there's a huge effect on your bottom line. Let me just, spell this out for you, and you could possibly see the bigger picture. But I think it's about constantly having that conversation, because, and we're seeing it in South Africa from political realignments, and we're seeing it globally from an AI ethics regulation. How do we tax? How do we govern? How do we report? Do we use the AI within our board? And how do we recalibrate? How are we looking within our region? So if I look at Africa as a region, and Bob asked me to comment on this, AI, and I had a really good session with a bank that presented something on scaling with AI and what is the ethics around AI from governance to operational. And one of the things and it's eye-opening, especially if you're not constantly involved in AI, and the nomenclature flies over your head and you think, but I should be knowing this because it's going to come across my boardroom table. And it lends back to exactly what Bob as well as Pradeep have alluded to in terms of learning. So as board members, you constantly need to be learning, maybe not in a formal setting, but in that curiosity kill the cat type of attitude where you can never know enough. You're not going to know all of it. You're probably going to need somebody much younger than you to explain it to you, or go, why don't you try this, and delve a little bit into it to understand it. But at the end of the day, you as the human being need to be present. So for me, that's a no-no. That's a no-no in terms of AI. You need to have the human element always. Then the second thing is from simulation and to simulating impact. So running a what-if scenario. So, or what-if stress test with the board. So, I know within our agendas, we're very limited, but sometimes taking out of a boardroom and going, what if we had a currency devaluation? How would that affect this board, this organization, this entity, whatever you're board over? If there was a shipping blockade, like we had earlier on with the up in Egypt, or we had issues and from an Africa perspective, up the west coast of Africa with all sorts of things not being able to move across the globe. What if we have a climate event, and that climate event can be something health or other related, and you've just had one now in Jamaica. So how does that impact? If we simulate that in this region, we don't just have hurricanes, we have hurricanes category 5, could be a category 5 that wipes out an entire nation. We were so lucky with this last one in the Caribbean. So I think the what if scenarios for me from a foresight and a future scanning, the horizon perspective are very important. I've introduced them into some of my boards, much smaller boards. Nigel mentioned on my profile, I sit on a board for a foundation which looks at circular economy, which tries to look at entrepreneurs or supporting entrepreneurs to look at a circular economy within all the little sort of work that they do, and then scaling that to have more impact. So my what ifs at that type of board is, what if we had the next, and I say Elon Musk because he's South African, and I'm not going to talk about going to Musk, but to look at how we reuse landfill, we reuse things like, and I met an entrepreneur from that same context. I met an entrepreneur who is selling property in space. And I looked at her and I said, why ever so? And she said, because that's the next frontier. And I looked at her with big saucer eyes going, but we have enough problems selling that property on Earth. So how do you think you're going to achieve that? And then there was an entrepreneur next to her who said, well, we're people that wait for those satellites to come down and we repurpose the materials that come out of that satellite. So, I mean, it's really thinking out of the box. So how are those things reused? Just from one thing that affects SDGs, etc. And then for me, strategizing, and like I said, we strategize to strategize sometimes as boards unnecessarily so. But do we actually strategize for resilience? Do we strategize by developing adaptive playbooks that get triggered, not waiting for the crisis to happen? So imagine, take yourself back to COVID, way back, South Africa shut down in March, but the story started that, November, December before in China. Now, how many boards were sitting at that stage going, what if, this had to happen? And I'll give you an example. I chaired a board at that time. We had put into place a digitalization strategy. We had put some money into it. And on a March evening, 10:30 p.m., I have a meeting. I have a message from the CEO who asks me, will you take my call? So I said, sure. What is it in connection with? And he says, the president's going to make an announcement tomorrow. We've received communication as one of the bodies that are linked to the presidency. So took his call and he said to me, I'm informing you, and I do not need a decision. I basically need a rubber stamp that we are going fully online digitally. And I had a few questions for him. And I said, but how? What are the risks? Can we do this within, turn around within 3 to 4 days? Because we know the decision or the president's message is imminent. We went the next morning, I contacted the board via WhatsApp, because now we had stopped, all the other channels had changed. We were doing things very differently. And I said to them, I'm calling an emergency meeting. We're needing to round robin this. It's not a decision. It's a rubber stamp. You've rubber stamped the investment into digitalization over a year ago. We're going to go live in 2 months, but we're needing to do that in the next 4 days. Can we have a meeting? Can we dispense with this? Give me your questions. Let's bring the CE in and his team. And we did it. And we very successfully in that March transitioned and had our first board meeting online for 8 hours. We don't do that anymore. We had a meeting for 8 hours online because nobody knew how to do meetings online because it was just something foreign to us. We've now got it down to that. Obviously, you're not going to have a board meeting ever for 8 hours. But those systems then were developed, and that's the whole thing from moving from awareness to action, because you're aware that something needs to change. And I wrote about this recently, and I spoke about it at a podcast last week. It's about whether you're in a war room or whether you are in whether you are the compass. And sometimes you are in a war room and you have to make some difficult decisions, but generally the board is the compass. The board is the person that they're going, okay, we're putting our money where our mouth is. This is what needs to be done. So from a practical perspective, it's good to take the jump, but it's also understanding that you've got the systems backing you up. I've also seen this in practice from a South African perspective, known or unknown to this group, this audience, is that we do have an energy crisis in South Africa, unfortunately. And there's been a lot written about it. There's been a lot of fraud and corruption, etc. But boards at that time, when the energy crisis occurred, if they simulated a failure of the grid system, they put things into place that would then allow them to continue working and therefore be able to float, basically. And it protected a few things. It protected confidence. It protected continuity. But those who viewed this whole energy crisis and being off the grid as a risk, and seeing it just as a compliance issue, froze, because you identify it, but you do nothing about it. So for me, action must follow awareness. Then from a foresight perspective, foresight is generally it's the discipline of seeing around the corner without knowing what's coming. Aptly put by Bob as well as Pradeep. We will never know. It's the unknown. And that's the whole point of foresight, right? But foresight is a prediction. It's a what if, it's a scenario planning, it's a simulation, it's putting us in that position and asking ourselves, what will we do if this happens? And it's preparation through perspective. And therein comes diverse boards, people that have not just similar thinkers, people who are not who just not raise their hands to make a decision, but question and think critically. Because if you're sitting, and Pradeep, from an engineering perspective, appreciate this, I find engineers to be wonderful board members. I normally sit on boards with too many accountants, and accountants only want to look at the figures. But engineers take you down another route because they think so differently and they question so differently. And so sometimes when we look at boards and we look at diversity of boards, we're needing to understand that even, and I had this recently for a board facilitation, I had a shop steward, if you understand the trade unions, I had a shop steward as a board member. And of course, her primary concern was what was happening with the workforce. And the chair of the board was worried about what was happening with the trust funds because he was an accountant by trade. So for me, or by profession, for me, having diversity of thought, equity and inclusion in a board is very, very important from a foresight perspective, and ensuring that there isn't a foresight deficit. And for me, we've lost the ability to imagine. So as board members, we get there and we're rich on data. We get all of the reports in the world. We get the reports the way we want to get it. We get the data presented in many different forms, from visual and figures. And we plan for quarters going forward. And we go in the next quarter, this is the budget, or this is what would be happening. But we never look at the future. We never look at where we would be heading if and when this should happen. What if there was another COVID? And I think most boards think about this. If there is another COVID, what would we do? But what if there's something that's not COVID? It's something totally different. Have we used our imagination to come up with a scenario that looks so different to what we've experienced before. We make sure that foresight is an agenda item. And sometimes having foresight as an agenda item puts it up front. It doesn't become an ad hoc conversation. It invites us to bring on, co-opt somebody just for that discussion. And maybe you want a futurist sitting at your board with all the, what people normally say, airy-fairy pie in the sky sort of stuff, because we don't think like that. So we've got to have somebody else in the room that pushes us to think in that manner. Pairing directors with a future mapping exercise. So linking a geopolitical, technological, and ethical variable, exactly what Pradeep said, and making sure that what we do with directors exactly. And I loved Bob's pest, right? Because then it gets directors to think circular and think in a very different manner and draw on different skills. So exactly that, pairing directors with a future mapping exercise and going, think out of the box, bring us a solution that's different. And then making sure that every decision that we make, we look at a future impact statement. So how will this choice or this decision position us in a year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, because the world's changing as quickly as it is. For me, an investment in foresight is not just boards being resilient; it's making them relevant to what we have going on in the globe. So if a board had a dashboard that reflected a real world interdependence, what would it actually show? So we had a globe, and the globe had little colors or pictures, for want of a better term. How would we combine that and look at it for supply chain, for instance? Is there a supply chain concentration risk? The red lines are danger, and we can see we shouldn't be shipping via Cape Town. We should be shipping across the Suez and then across, and changing the way in which we do things, changing the way in which we supply, or we would look at non-financial dependencies. Sourcing. So, and I have a real example in my accounting practice at the moment. I've got an India company based as a branch here in South Africa, sourcing out of China, arriving via the port in Durban, being supplied into Johannesburg, then into the rest of Africa. And suddenly we've been told it could be cheaper to do it from India than from China. And so now sitting with those very real examples, and a business in Zimbabwe who has 60% tariff slapped onto them, and he's saying, I'm not going to source out of South Africa just because of the type of corruption that sits within the system. So I need to source alternate, but I have no port that it could come through except for Kenya. So how do we change that? And sitting to make those decisions so those directors are able to navigate a supply chain concentration risk, because all of the products generally come out of China. So it's a wonderful problem to have, but it also gets you thinking and gets you to get the directors thinking in a very different way, not just from the finance, but from the other side. Also from energy and digital sovereignty. So for me, what degree of control you have over your energy supplies and your platforms and your data, and how is that feeding into the decisions that are being made at boards, or you assisting people to make decisions with? Political stability and policy viability. You all may know, may or may not know, that South Africa chairs the G20, and we're getting, and our chairing session ends now on the 30th of November. I've been a part of a few discussions from a B20, a business perspective, and we've had a few iterations of women and civil society, and all the other tracks to come together. But for me, it's taking economic participation. It's making sure we address key priorities, and we feeding into a discussion on policy. We're feeding into, and it's a global discussion. So it's the first time that I sit at a G20 level in a task force. And it was interesting to note that we had people out of Italy and Brazil and wherever it's been held before, feeding into this conversation, saying, let's drive this narrative this time around. Let's make sure these policy shifts take place for those 19 countries that sit there. And a lot of them, it's between Europe and there's a whole lot of other countries. But for me, the theme of the G20 this year in terms of solidarity, solidarity, equity, and sustainability is so fitting into all of the other things we do, from World Economic Forum to COP, to everything else that sits on the globe working towards a common purpose. As I spoke to Kamala before the session, we spoke about in this age of AI and ESG and governance, it's not about compliance and it's not about ticking, it's about conscious navigation. I see a thing on the time there, so I'm going to stop. But conscious navigation means an individual accountability to what my role is, well, individually, within my family, within my community, within my country, within my continent, and then the globe, and making sure that we can draw on our histories to actually move the dial forward. I want to end with one thing, which, and I have a lot more to say, but we'll pick it up on the discussions. I want this to become conscious stewards. I want us to become conscious stewards. I want us to stop managing the past. I want us to curate the future, but I want us to know that resilience is not about bouncing back. It's about bouncing forward, but with clarity, information, and data that we have at our hands. And so my last question is, are we designing our boards for continuity or for curiosity? And I'd leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very insightful, very provoking insights. What I like your awareness to action, sensing, simulating, strategizing. What came to mind as you were speaking was the fact that most of us are focused on the urgent and important as opposed to the important and not urgent, which is where the real thinking and strategizing happen, and deliberately setting aside time for that future, looking at this future, as you put it, making sure we have futurists, we do the future mapping, and we have our future impact statements. Just taking the time to do that can add so much value, and then having the governance around ensuring that we put whatever that comes out of that into action is so very important, because we're so many times caught up in the day-to-day and the crises that we lose sight of the long term, or even the medium term for that matter. So thank you very much for that. I'll open it up. I think, how long do we have, Kamala?
I'm so sorry. We have 5 minutes, so not a lot of time for discussion. But I truly hope that our panelists will be able to stay on, because as we move into the next panel, we would also have time to engage and have the conversation today. So just 5 minutes to wrap up. So maybe just ask each of our panelists for some closing thoughts.
All right. Well, let's start with Bob, and we'll go to Pradeep and then Kantha. Bob?
No, it's not time to do any wrap up at the moment. I'm very happy to let this conversation just roll at the moment.
But we only have 5 minutes, so we don't have time to roll. The next panel starts in, right now it's 4 minutes. So
okay, then I'm out.
Pradeep?
It was wonderful to be here on this panel, and I must congratulate you for starting a dialogue on geopolitical issues. It is a must. People think that we can forget about it and do the business. We cannot, and all businesses must be fully aware how to deal with the geopolitical issues and not be scared of it, but see how we can move ahead in spite of geopolitical difference. But I must congratulate. This was a very good topic that you have thought of. Thank you.
Thank you very much for participating and sharing your thoughts. Kantha?
I'll be very quick. I think we need a values-based governance framework, and we need future-fit foresight. And Dr. Peter Crow, a very good friend of mine, talks about fit for purpose and not best practice. So I want to leave you with that, because fit for purpose is what will get you over the line.
Fit for purpose will get you over the line. Thank you very much. I think we have had a very good start to the conference, and I think it's important. For me, I tell people all the time, as a chairman, as a leader, you should be doing two things. You should be mining for conflict and farming for dissent. You want every brain in the game, every voice in the room, and you want to really get them engaged and listening and contributing with that guidance as to, okay, what's our purpose? Why do we exist? What are our guiding principles? And what should we be focused on from the perspective of delivering on that purpose in a rapidly changing world? It's a big challenge, but I think we have set the tone here today, and I look forward to the other sessions, the other two sessions today, and then we have 3 more tomorrow. But very, very good perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank
Kamla,
you.
over to you.